As stated in the previous lesson, as the Enlightenment progressed, those in the middle classes saw the benefits of questioning government, while those in the aristocracy properly divined the threat to their power it represented. Meanwhile, those in the lower classes did not bother themselves with ideological and philosophical debates, but instead how they would survive in the world. And whenever the ideological and philosophical debates threatened their livelihood, then they rose up. And the world was changing around them. Industrialization was now beginning to change the landscape, while the constant wars pursued by their sovereigns and/or sovereign governments threatened to undermine the basic infrastructure of life for the people in their countries. In the face of enlightenment and the threats of the day, governments did try and enact reforms, while people began looking for accountability and reasons for the problems that beset them. And sometimes they went to very dark places in order to find the reasons for the problems that beset them. All in all, the standard of life was actually improving in Europe, which of course meant that people began to demand even more and expect even more. Public health initiatives such as better methods of sewage and water treatment and sanitation made conditions better in the cities. There was also a medical shift taking place. The state replaced charitable houses with hospitals and clinics that were regulated. Enlightenment leaders led an emphasis on bathing and personal sanitation to lower the rate of disease and minor ailments associated with poor personal hygiene. During this period, Enlightenment leaders altered the role of children. Prior to the Enlightenment, children were seen as nothing more than miniature adults. With the Enlightenment, children began to be seen as separate from adults, as developing beings rather than simply miniature beings. Societies and governments began to develop educational opportunities, create schools, demand mandatory education for children to keep them off the streets. In addition, a lively toy and children's literature industry, especially in the German states, began to grow. The Germans became the great toy makers of Europe. Of course, the development that would radically change the landscape of Europe and other regions was industrialization. And it was in Britain that industrialization first really took shape in the 1770s and the 1780s. Industrial growth in Britain was due to four trends. You will remember that in the wake of both the 30 Years' War and the English Civil Wars, that land holdings consolidated, which meant that numerous tenants either left or were pushed off of their land. These people headed for the cities, sparking a massive urban population growth. Secondly, steam-powered machinery, which we know existed as far back as Roman times, was finally put into practical use. Third, the urban growth meant that a concentration of labor in the factories now existed. And finally, the shift from wool to cotton textile production meant that you could mass produce more clothing. Wool was a rather finite resource. Cotton, on the other hand, was far more copious in its amounts, in its development. There were major inventions during this time. The flying shuttle, the spinning jenny, and the water frame made for mass production of cloth. James Watt created the improved steam engine, and a steam engine that could actually be hooked up to the flying shuttle, spinning jenny, and water frame. Edmund Cartwright created the mechanized loom to weave cloth even more in mass production. And you also had a form of proto-industrialization called the domestic system, in which people, rather than just simply at factories, made the clothing at home, and this created a nice variety in the marketplace. On the left is a flying shuttle. You can see how it would be put in and out of the threads with thread itself. And on the right, you see a spinning jenny. Here you see an example of a water frame. Here in the British Museum of Industrialization, you see a model of Watt's steam engine. And in the lower right, you see a drawing of the steam engine attached to a spinning jenny. Now, when it came to politics, crowns, thrones, and territory, and who would occupy them, often occupied the rulers of Europe during this period. And the War of the Austrian Succession erupted over who would sit on the Austrian throne. Now, the War of the Austrian Succession is actually a series of wars made up of wars like King George's War between Britain and France in North America, the War of Jenkins's Ear between Britain and Spain, which began when a Spanish ship boarded a British ship and cut off the ear of the captain, the First Carnatic War in India. Now, the conflict began when the Emperor of Austria, Charles VI, who was also the Holy Roman Emperor, died in 1740, and he had no male heirs. Instead, his daughter, Maria Theresa Walburga Amalia Christina, whom he referred to simply as Maria Theresa, was the only surviving heir to the Habsburg throne, but no woman had ever sat upon the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. But Charles, back in 1713, had brokered what was called the Pragmatic Sanction to ensure that his daughter would sit on the throne of Austria at the very least. However, the states of Saxony, Prussia, Bavaria, which are all German states, and the French all repudiated this agreement once Charles died. So the war breaks out, and you have Prussia on the side of France and Austria on the side of Britain. And while this was over the crown of Austria, the real focus of the war was the Austrian possession of a region that's now in Poland called Silesia. It was very rich in material wealth, it was very affluent, and the Prussians really wanted that. So the war goes on for quite a while, 8 years to be exact, and it is finally ended by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which again, Aix-la-Chapelle is Charlemagne's old capital city from the old Holy Roman Empire. We call it now today the city of Aachen in Germany. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was signed by Britain, France, and the Dutch Republic. Notice that Austria and Prussia are not signatories here. They were simply presented with the terms of the treaty. You could either accept them or you could continue the war on your own. And since France and Britain were the chief financiers of this war, both Prussia and Austria had to go along with this. And so Austria, Spain, Prussia, Sardinia had very little choice but to comply, and they signed separately. The terms of the treaty were this: Maria Theresa would be recognized as the Empress of Austria. The Prussians would get Silesia. So the Prussians had no trouble signing this treaty. They got what they wanted out of this. But other than this, very little was gained by either side. The French took some British possessions, the British took some French possessions in North America, and then they gave it all back. This was a perfect compromise because everybody left the table feeling that they didn't get all that they wanted. And the treaty really failed to resolve the issues that caused the war in the first place. Now, what is the lesson of this war? The War of Austrian Succession taught that in order to achieve overwhelming victory, a nation must employ overwhelming force, not apply a small army with limited objectives. In other words, limited war is not a really good way of fighting a war. One little side note as well. Maria Theresa would have several children. Her youngest daughter she named Antoinette, as in Marie Antoinette. The red dot marks the area where Silesia is located. You notice that it's almost dead center of the European continent. It was an area that was very rich in natural resources. very good agriculturally as well. And the Prussian state wanted Silesia to really bring its unity together even more. And I'll explain that a little bit later. The biggest result of the War of the Austrian Succession was the diplomatic revolution of 1756. What we see here is a reversal of alliances. Prussia became an ally of Great Britain, while Austria was then driven into the arms of their ancient rival France. Sweden and Russia also joined the French in this. Now, the Prussians and the British got together. They signed the Treaty of Westminster in 1756. And the British used this so that the Prussians would protect the German state of Hanover. Because remember that King George II, who was the king at this particular time, was also Prince Elector of Hanover. And so the Prussians, being a German state, would protect the German state of Hanover. And Britain, in this treaty, agreed that they would not aid Austria in anything anymore. This, of course, means that the Austrians go looking for a client, and they find it, or looking for a sponsor, I should say, and they find it in the French. This is the first Treaty of Versailles. Notice that there are going to be many treaties signed at Versailles. This is where France allies with Austria, and it was followed by a second treaty a year later in which they sort of cement this alliance. Now, what happened with this is that when the British abandoned the Prussians in 1762, after only 6 years, the Prussians said, screw the British, and they allied themselves with the Russians. And this left Britain almost all alone during the Revolutionary War. And I know this starts to get complicated after a while, but you can see some of the consequences. Also, to cement the Austrian alliance with France, Maria Theresa would send her youngest daughter, to marry the future French king. And this is why Marie Antoinette becomes the Queen of France and the wife of Louis XVI. The War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, King George's War, King William's War, Queen Anne's War. These were all basically warm-ups for the big show. The big show was the 7 Years' War, which broke out in 1756. And many historians consider the 7 Years' War to be the first truly world war. It was a global conflict. It spanned 5 continents. It affected Europe, the Americas, West India, India itself, West Africa, and the Philippines. It also took place on the high seas. This is where you get the Master and Commander series. As a part of the conflict, the French and Indian War in North America began 2 years earlier in the Ohio River Valley at a place called Jumonville Glen. And there, a 22-year-old colonel in the Virginia militia named George Washington attacked a French force. Now, the war started very poorly for the British. The British coordination of their war effort was very, very haphazard. But in the end, the British turned the tide in the year 1759. They defeated and humiliated France. And the reason that they were able to bring this defeat about is that their Prime Minister, William Pitt, comes to office and says, if we're going to fight this war, it's not going to be with one arm tied behind our backs. He dedicates the entire British treasury to the war. And in this way, the British are able to defeat and humiliate the French. The Treaty of Paris comes at just the right moment for Britain because Britain had gone broke with this war. But it ushered in an era of British dominance outside of Europe. The French lost all of Canada and the Ohio Valley to the British. The only presence France retained in the Western Hemisphere was Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, and the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe. In 1762, France, realizing that it was going to lose the war, transferred Louisiana and New Orleans to the Spanish in a secret treaty called the Treaty of Fontainebleau. This would lead to a revolt among the French-speaking colonists in Louisiana, and this is why Alexander O'Reilly, Don Alejandro O'Reilly, had to go in and suppress this rather bloodily. Spain lost Florida to the British, but retained its empire in Mexico and Central America. And perhaps the worst of this aftermath was called the Derangement. It is the ethnic cleansing of the Acadians from Nova Scotia. Those Acadians who would not take an oath of loyalty to the king were forced off of lands that they had inhabited for generations. And without any place to go, the Spanish in Louisiana invited them to come down to South and Southwest Louisiana, and they became the Cajuns as we know today. Now, the Austrians and the Prussians had their own treaty called the Treaty of Hubertsburg, and this restored the status quo. It made Prussia a great power under its king, Frederick II, who would be known as the Great. What's the aftermath of the war? The aftermath of the war was that there were major French military reforms. The French realized that their artillery was substandard, and they dedicated their whole military educational complex to developing better artillery and better artillery officers. Now, why is that significant? Guess who one of the greatest French artillery officers will be? A young Corsican named Napoleon Bonaparte. There's also massive war debt and revolutionary turmoil in France. People are really pissed off at the king, Louis XV, a very weak king. There's also a massive war debt for Britain. Britain had gone broke winning this war. Britain now needs to pay for the war. And they turn to their North American colonies and they say, we did this for you so that you could expand and move out. It's time for you to help pay the bill. And this will lead to a fundamental alteration of the relationship between Britain and her colonies. Now, this is the map of North America prior to the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, which is called the French and Indian War in North America. You can see the areas controlled by Spain, Britain, and France. Now, you can see that the map changes drastically after the French and Indian War and the Treaty of Paris, as Britain takes all of the French possessions, and you see only Haiti, and you can't even see Guadeloupe on there because it's in the Antilles down there. One state that really comes out of the 7 Years' War smelling like roses, even better than Britain, was Prussia. Now, Prussia was under the leadership of its king, Frederick the Great, or Friedrich the Great. Known in Germany, he was Der Alte Fritz, or Old Fritz. His tenure is the standard by which the Prussian and later German militarism was measured. Yet, as a young prince, Frederick the Great was more interested in music and philosophy than the art of war. He corresponded with Voltaire. He supported the arts and philosophers he favored, as well as allowing complete freedom of the press and literature. Frederick the Great was probably a homosexual. He showed little love for his wife. He produced no children. He also despised his father, whom he thought cruel. And at one point, when he was young, he even tried essentially to defect to Britain before he was captured and thrown in prison for a time. Then he was pardoned and allowed to get back into the military. Frederick is the one who consolidates Prussia into a more unified entity, because at this point, Prussia was more of a scattered number of territories than it was a unified state. However, he proved to be an outstanding commander in the field. Again, it shows that sexuality has nothing to do whatsoever with military prowess. He developed the cantonist system in Prussia, in which each county, called a canton, provided enough soldiers to become a regiment. So you had regiments for every county in Prussia. You had military reservists. These were the Junkers and the nobles. The Junkers are the aristocracy of Prussia. They trained 2 to 3 months annually. More than 2/3 of the state budget of Prussia went to support the military. And the Prussian war machine, through the War of the Austrian Succession and the partition of Poland-Lithuania in 1772, helped the state emerge from the 7 Years' War as a major power. However, it also suffered financially because, in case you did not know, wars cost money. That being said, Frederick the Great is considered to be one of the greatest military leaders and minds there ever was. In fact, when Napoleon would go and visit his grave, he said, if this man was alive, I would have lost all these wars. So this map shows in the light blue the region known as Prussia, or Prussia Brandenburg, it can also be called. You can see that it is a patchwork quilt of states that doesn't have a whole lot of cohesion. Frederick knew that this left his holdings very vulnerable, and he wanted to bring his holdings together. And here you see Prussia after the 7 Years' War, and notice how it's come together. Now, at this point, it's not a large state by a long shot, but it has much more cohesion. And since it is so strong militarily, it can exercise a great deal of power over its fellow German states like Saxony, Bavaria, Brunswick, Hesse, Hanover, and so forth. And you know, I always like to throw a little side note in here from time to time. This is Frederick's younger brother, Henry, or Heinrich. He was also enlightened. He amassed a huge library in his palace, which eventually became the University of Berlin. Now, Henry, being the younger brother, chafed under his older brother's shadow. He wanted very badly to have his own princedom. He even wanted to become king of Poland, but Frederick would not allow that. In 1786, either Nathaniel Gorham, who was that time president of the American Continental Congress, or Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben, the famous Baron von Steuben, who was the Prussian general who served in the Continental Army, suggested to Alexander Hamilton that Henry should become monarch of the United States. And at first there was, well, let's have your people talk to my people. But in the end, the prince declined. So the United States never got a king. One of Frederick's soldiers became one of the greatest soldiers of the Continental Army in North America. I've already mentioned him. Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand von Steuben, or just Baron von Steuben as we call him in the country. He was a Prussian and later an American military officer. He served as Inspector General and Major General of the Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War. He was one of the fathers of the Continental Army in teaching them the essentials of military drill, tactics, and discipline. He wrote regulations for the order and discipline of the troops of the United States, which is the first manual of the U.S. Army. And it would serve as the Army's drill manual for decades. He served as George Washington's chief of staff in the final years of the war. Now, Valley Forge is often thought of as a terrible time for the Continental Army. You read about that in your social studies books. But the hardships at Valley Forge lasted only a few months. See, it's in Valley Forge that the Continental Army developed its identity. Steuben left Prussia under a cloud of suspicion that he was a homosexual. He arrived in Valley Forge in 1777. He could not speak English, and the soldiers could not speak German. But Steuben could speak French, and the officers could understand French. So Steuben yelled at the officers in French like a drill sergeant would. The officers, in turn, barked orders to the men in English. What this did is it brought discipline and order to a very undisciplined and disorderly army at the time. and turned it into a rather feared war machine when it emerged from Valley Forge in the spring of 1778. It was not just in the military that states began to reform themselves. The state reforms of the 1700s included administrative and legal reforms, such as in Prussia and Austria, where a uniform code of laws developed as the nations began to consolidate their holdings. You want to have a uniform code of law. In Russia, Catherine the Great enacted legal reform and put an end to torture. The church was not immune to reform either. Enlightenment criticisms justified many rulers and monarchs harnessing the scope and power of the church. The Jesuits, long considered troublemakers and agents of the Pope, were officially disbanded in 1759 and expelled from Austria, Portugal, Spain, and Sicily. In the Austrian Empire, bishops were required to swear fidelity to the emperor, which the Pope probably had a few things to say. Seminaries come under state supervision. Monasteries were liquidated because of the great wealth they contained. And church tithes were abolished, thus ending the double tax on the peasants of that realm. Enlightenment philosophers greatly advocated religious toleration. In Austria, freedom of worship was extended to Protestants, Jews, and Orthodox Christians. While in France, the new King Louis XVI restored some Protestant civil rights. Again, though, I continue to beat the drum on counter-reactions. There is resistance to reform that was often instigated by fearful nobles. When the Austrian Emperor Joseph, the brother of Marie Antoinette, died without a direct heir, his brother Leopold II rolled back numerous reforms initiated by his brother and put the serfs back into servitude. In Prussia, nobles resisted agricultural innovations because that meant that the workers would be less engaged, and they wanted the workers as engaged as possible so that they would not start thinking about reforms or rebellions. In France, though, the resistance was greatest. Louis XV was a weak king, and he often yielded to the nobles and replaced the parliaments that Louis XIV had established with appointed courts, that is, with nobles on the courts again. Now, Louis XVI, whom many thought at first would be a good king, reversed the reform and reinstituted the parliaments. However, Louis XVI proved to be not quite as able as thought. His chief minister, Jacques Turgot, a French economist who wanted to reform the French economy, frightened the nobility by promoting elected local assemblies, and then he deregulated grain, which meant that the prices were going to go up. Well, Turgot was forced from office by a fearful nobility and jealous rivals who saw him as far too close to the king. But people got very frustrated when men of ability were being forced out of government, and this sows the seeds of revolution. What also continued to raise its head like a pustule was the specter of anti-Semitism. Now, what is anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism is any form of discrimination, hostility, and or prejudice directed toward Jews. The term anti-Semitism did not come into use until the 1800s, but it has existed since, really, the Crusades. You have several types of anti-Semitism. There's political and economic anti-Semitism. It's the belief that the Jews somehow control the strings of finance and government. This is the anti-Semitism of people like Charles Lindbergh later in the United States, and somebody as long ago like Marcus Tullius Cicero. There's theological anti-Semitism, the belief that Judaism is an inferior religion and or that the Jews killed the Christ. There's nationalistic anti-Semitism. This is fueled by the Enlightenment and Voltaire. Jews were stereotyped as arrogant and greedy and separatist for their Sabbath and dietary laws. Remember, Enlightenment philosophers want people to grow beyond their their religious devotions and so forth. And Jews were not quite willing to do that at times. And therefore they were seen as undermining the national fabric. There's racial anti-Semitism. That is the belief that would be held by the Nazis during the Holocaust, that the Jews were Untermenschen. They were lower class of individual, lower beings. Now, anti-Semitism in the 16th and 17th centuries. You see Shakespeare. Shylock is the villain of the Merchant of Venice. In 1655, Cromwell reversed a previous policy and expelled all the Jews from England. In Prussia, Jews were designated as protected and unprotected. Protected meant that they worked in a skilled trade. Unprotected meant that they were peasant Jews. In Austria, Maria Theresa made the Jews pay a fee every 10 years for readmission to Bohemia. This was called the Queen's money. You actually put a special tax on people for living in your realm. In France, anti-Semitism was very high, but there were numerous calls by both nobles and the middle class for Jewish emancipation, that is, allowing them to hold office, to vote, to serve on juries, and so forth. Here are some examples of anti-Semitic propaganda. On the left is a French elections poster from the year 1889 for a self-described candidat antisemite, and his name was Adolphe Willet. Adolf, of course. The Jews are a different race, hostile to our own. Judaism, there is the enemy. On the right is a World War II era propaganda poster from Slovakia, and it exhorts readers not to be a servant to the Jew. What was the problem, though, for the lower classes, and what led to desire for accountability and then riots, was the grain problem and then the court of public opinion. Deregulation of grain meant high prices and famine. In 1775, almost at the same time that the soldiers of the Massachusetts militia are being fired upon by the British at Lexington and Concord, a massive food riot in Paris broke out that stemmed from poor harvests and withholding of grain. When peasants begged the governor of the French region of Dijon, after whom the mustard is named, for bread, he uttered those famous words that would later be recalled during the Revolution. The grass has sprouted. Go to the fields and browse on it. It meant telling the people, go graze on grass, eat the grass. What also inflamed the populace was the growing industry of printing. Newspapers were the blogosphere of the day and could sway public opinion much like the Blaze on the right or Vox on the left or any left or right-leaning website could do today. Newspapers and circulars could also be employed by the monarchies whenever their policies conflicted with the aristocracy. For instance, in Sweden, King Gustavus III separated governmental powers. Montesquieu would have been happy about that. He abolished torture, and this is an Enlightenment thing. Enlightenment people don't like torture. And he allowed freedom of the press. In France, the press was used to illuminate reforms, especially those concerning women. And in British North America, the colonial presses helped overturn the Stamp Act of 1765, which was the attempt by the British government to start collecting from the colonies their fair share of the war cost. Colonial presses also advised colonists on methods of resistance to the British. What you're seeing is that the colonial presses are the engines of the American Revolution. At times, criticism of the government or the monarch could go too far, and there were laws on the books to punish anyone who was guilty of lèse-majesté, which was any sort of insult to the monarch or the government in a way that lowered their dignity. In England, a fellow by the name of John Wilkes, that's a rather familiar name, don't you think? He was a critic of the Crown and Parliament and did so publicly. He was elected to Parliament, but Parliament would not seat him. Well, public opinion in the newspapers now made it so that Wilkes was allowed to sit in Parliament. When Parliament begins to talk about Catholic emancipation, the anti-Catholic presses in England sparked the Gordon riots, which was a reaction against Catholic emancipation. And then comes the great story, The Marriage of Figaro, by Pierre Beaumarchais. It was later composed into an opera by Mozart. It lampooned the master-servant relationship. The Marriage of Figaro often nowadays is the basis for those stories where, you know, the butler or the house servant is far smarter or more with it than the foolish master. Of course, this was a direct slight at the monarchs, saying that the monarchs aren't the smartest, it's their servants. And so many of the monarchs banned it. And when the monarchs banned it, this made the Marriage of Figaro even that much more popular. In public opinion beyond Europe, in North America, Parliament was seen as corrupt, out of touch with the colonists, not representative of the colonists. This is where the Stamp Act riot comes about in 1765 and the Great Cry, no taxation without representation. Later on, you'd have the Tea Act of 1773, which would result in newspapers being published telling people to rise up, and what will happen? They'll dump $1 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor. You'll then have the calling of the First Continental Congress, and eventually you'll have the independence of a new nation because of how public opinion was manipulated and controlled.